Hello. Um, Last night I was talking with a friend, and this is someone who is a meditation practitioner. And though I've never explicitly asked him, my sense from our conversations is that he's a daily practitioner. And again, I don't know for sure, but my sense is he's been doing it for 10, 20, possibly longer, 20 years, possibly longer. And he seems quite dedicated. And so we share some commonalities in terms of our interest in meditation, and not just interest but our engagement or commitment to it. And he had cited, or he made a comment, a fairly commonly heard comment about how all religions or most spiritual paths meet at the same point in the end, akin to if one has a mountain, there may be many paths that climb up that mountain, but they all meet at the top. And in light of that comment, he made some personal comments about himself, that sometimes in his spiritual life he feels a little tired, and that he wants a break, and the issue is, once he takes a break, he wants to stay in the break, and it becomes hard to get back on task of continuing the climb. And even though he didn't use this term, the term that occurred to me was perhaps something like spiritual fatigue, is what I heard him sharing about. And then later he invoked or brought up another image for the spiritual life that's common, that's sometimes heard in Buddhism, which is swimming upstream. So within that tradition, sometimes it's said that those who what we would call are immersed in the world, or samsara, or just living a worldly life, are just drifting downstream. They're just being carried away by the forces of culture and society and the world, and they're just doing what everyone else is doing. Whereas the serious practitioner is said to be going against it in many ways. So not in pursuit of riches and stability, societal, how should I put it, like not seeking security and stability outside of ourselves. And so anyway, this image of swimming upstream is an image. And again, he talked about, well, if we think of it that way, one could think of like swimming upstream in a river. So you're going against the current upstream, and occasionally there are islands, and sometimes he wants to just plop down on an island and take a long break. The same sentiment. And as I was listening, I don't know if this is I don't know where I inherited this tendency, but my tendency is to try to find a point of reference within my own experience where I can relate to what the speaker or the person is talking about, so that there's a sense of connection. And no matter how much I tried, I couldn't connect to that experience that he was talking about. So I was just listening kind of as an outsider. And later on, it occurred to me to think of the term spiritual fatigue. And so and this was happening within a matter of like 30 seconds to a minute, where I couldn't think of any, because usually I can think of something within a few seconds. And so then I wondered, why is it? What's at the bottom of this inability, or why am I not able to relate to what he's talking about? So I'm somebody who is fairly dedicated and committed to his own spiritual growth and set of practices that I engage in daily, and multiple times a day, and I come back to it over and over and over, and yet I couldn't relate to this sense of spiritual fatigue that I was hearing from my friend. And then the conversation went other places, but in the back of my mind I kept thinking about this. And then later it occurred to me, I think I know why. And we were still talking, so I shared with him why I think. And what I shared with him is that I think there's a book called The Metaphors We Live By. That may not be the right title, but I read this book. It was by two cognitive psychologists. Anyway, it's a great book. I've mentioned it before, but it's a little dry, possibly for a regular, like a sort of mainstream audience. But it talked about the kind of metaphors we tend to use implicitly in our thinking and in our speech, but mostly in our thinking. And I realized, oh, I actually don't use the metaphor in my own spiritual life of climbing a mountain to get to the top or swimming upstream. And I thought, if those were my metaphors, I imagine that one of the natural consequences would be I would want to take a break, right? If the metaphor is I'm going to climb a mountain, well, that sounds very arduous. Or I got to swim upstream the whole time, my whole life, every moment. Of course, I'm going to want to take a break on an island. And then I began to, so while we're talking, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking this, so it sounds like I'm a terrible listener, but there were breaks where I could just think about things. And I asked myself, what is the metaphor? What are the set of images that undergird my spiritual life? And I think that's an interesting question. So at this point, really the point of this video isn't to talk about the metaphors that I live by, but it's really to pose a question to you. I think it's worth exploring, how do you see your spiritual life? What is the metaphor that resonates for you? And just like I think their names are Lakoff and Nunez, who wrote the book that I mentioned earlier. I think it's called Metaphors We Live By. I'm going to have to look that up later. These implicit metaphors have a lot of control. They shape our experience in many ways, and they can support certain things, but they can also limit certain things. Just like, so his metaphor of his spiritual life being climbing a mountain to get to the top has, in my opinion, a limitation of it creates this natural reaction of fatigue. Like, this is an arduous task to climb this mountain, that my spiritual life is an arduous pursuit. And so I think it's worth reflecting on. I imagine that there are many metaphors that one can take. And so that's really what this video is about. Now, that's the main point. For those who happen to be interested, you might watch part 2, where I'm going to share sort of, because he asked me then, what is the metaphor? So I explained most of this to him, and he said, so what's the metaphor for you? And so in part 2, that's what I'm going to talk about.